Hello everyone, this is Professor Reimer. This video is for my world history class on Monday, March 22nd and Tuesday, March 23rd. It's entitled Unit 8, DOL 1, The Industrial Revolution. In this lesson, we will explain the major causes and effects of the Industrial Revolution by completing a get the picture activity. This is an activity we haven't done before, but it's related to many other activities that we've done, and I'll explain how to do it at the end. But first, let's, as always, begin with a preview. So think about some of the technology inventions of the previous 10 years. What are they, and how have they changed how you live in the last 10 years? So pause the video and do that now. All right. So what you might have said, Instagram, you might have said the internet, you might have said driverless cars. I don't know. But we were living in an age of rapid changes in our society. Today, we're diving in to a previous age in which rapid changes were happening. Some argue far more consequential than the political revolutions that we looked at in the previous unit, because those political revolutions, they changed borders and they changed rulers, but they didn't really change the way people live. People still live primarily on farms, and they had short lifespans, and they didn't leave their villages and travel very, very far. They made things by hand. In this industrial age, all that is going to change. So let's dive into it. Sorry, there's no note-taking guide this time, so you're just gonna need to make notes on paper. Set it up the way we've set it up before, with space on the left and space on the right. Space on the right is where you're going to be able to take your notes. And remember, we're analyzing the causes and effects of this thing we call the Industrial Revolution. So first of all, let's begin with this definition. What do I mean when I say what is industrialization? It is something you are going to hear a lot more in this class as well as in next year. So it's an increase in production, right? Humans now can make more stuff. How? Well, we now use machines. And powering those machines is a new source of energy. So prior to the Industrial Revolution, humans primarily powered their tools using their muscles or the muscles of their draft animals. Now humans are going to begin to use steam and then electricity, and we're still discovering new sources of energy, solar, wind, to power these machines. So that is what industrialization is. The question that we're going to primarily focus on is, why did it begin in England first? It could have began in China, it could have began in India, but it didn't. It began in England at roughly the same time as the American French revolutions, this mid to late 18th century. So what did England have that gave it advantages? Well, number one, and perhaps most importantly, it had enormous supplies of cheap coal. It's cheap because it was pretty near the surface. You didn't have to work hard to dig down deep. And you see there in yellow these areas of coal producing regions of England. So they're Newcastle, they're in Manchester, but it was really found all throughout the country. And so because this coal was cheap, it could very easily be used, very cheaply used, to power these new machines that are going to be invented. We'll get to those in just a minute. But England also has another key advantage. Oh, sorry, a little bit more about coal. So right, it's more powerful than water. So like the power generated from burning coal is a lot more powerful. You can make iron from it, which is much stronger, and then that iron can be turned into a stronger metal called iron, with some key innovations there that you see. So, but it all stems from this large supply of cheap coal. And just to give you some numbers, right, in 1800, right on the the cusp of the Industrial Revolution, Britain is producing a ton of coal. 114 years later, 250 million tons, with 1.2 million miners digging it out of the ground. A dramatic increase, largely done by children, because they were smaller. They can travel through these narrow tunnels. It is dangerous. It is dirty work. All right, so England has this large supply of cheap energy, cheap coal. It also has one of the lowest wages, one of the highest wages in the world at the time, for reasons not entirely known, but just some numbers there. So London, the average worker earned 11 grams of silver per day. In Amsterdam, on continental Europe, that's 9 grams. In Beijing, in China, 4 grams of silver per day, and in Delhi city, in India, less than 2 grams of silver per day. So why is that important? Well, it leads businessmen and others in England to search for ways to cut their costs. So they innovate, right? And they have this large supply of cheap coal, and now they have these key innovations that are fueling these inventions of machines and this shift to new power, as we said in the beginning. Britain also has a few other things going for it. It has an increasing supply of laborers, right, that are losing their farmlands and their common areas of farmland to what's known as the Enclosure Movement. Basically, it means the British government fenced off formerly public lands that are now private, selling it to wealthy landowners, and the farmers who used to use those common lands are now, not able to use them, and so they are increasingly moving to the cities and working in with these new machines. Britain also has many navigable rivers, and that's important because it's able to move the coal from the coal producing regions um, to where it's needed and the products to be moved. But these canals are also going to power some of the earliest machines, right? Also, so basically, canals are just man-made rivers, right? So you dig a ditch in the ground, it fills with water, and then you can move goods across it. All right, like I said, some key inventions, right? These machines that are used to produce these goods are a key part of this industrial revolution, right? And it really begins in the textile manufacturing, right? Textiles are these cloths that we weave, and then we spin and then we weave, right? So like from cotton or from sheep, right? You have this cloth, right? You have to spin it into yarn, and then you have to weave it into a fabric that you're going to then use to make a shirt or a jacket, right? It used to be primarily done by hand or this foot powered energy, but remember, we're talking about a shift to using machines, right? So new looms are invented to be able to weave the cloth faster, right? Also a flying shuttle. All of this is going to increase the speed at which textiles could be made, right? A power loom is invented. And what is powering these? First, water from the rivers, and eventually coal, right? And the way that coal is able to power them is with this invention of James Watt's steam engine, probably the most important invention. So you burn the coal, right? Creates steam. Steam, the pressure of the steam pushes a this is not my area of expertise. What's it called? Oh, I forget. Right. But it then powers the machine. Originally, it was used to pull the water out of the mine so you can dig the coal, but its applications are expanded, something like a tractor, but eventually to ships in the 19th century, and eventually the creation of the locomotive, which dramatically changes life, right? Cuts down travel. It leads to a boom in the metals like the steel used to lay the rails. Just one example, right? Look at this journey times from London to Edinburgh in Scotland, from 43 hours to just 12 and a quarter, from Birmingham from 11 to 3. So the railroad is going to dramatically change lives, and we'll talk more about the railroad in the course. All right, so another key invention, and that we don't really think about this as an invention, but is this idea of a factory system. Remember, I said work used to be done primarily at the home, primarily in small villages, right? You worked either in the fields or you worked in your house making handcrafts. Typically, this was done by women, right, who did the spinning in the weaving, or you had the shoemakers who have a little shop. Industrialization is going to change all of that, and it's really the work of Richard Arkwright who pioneers this new system. So what a factory is this large building or series of buildings that concentrates production all in one place. So instead of having it scattered throughout the various villages, you're going to bring it to one place. And why? Because that was where the source of power, right? Either the river at first, but then eventually where the coal is, right? So you can have the coal very quickly and cheaply move from the ground to powering your machines. That's going to save you money, but it requires an enormous amount of capital and investment, meaning money to buy these machines, money to pay these workers, and it's a slow process, right? Like in 1850, only 10% of the English industry is being in a factory, but it will dramatically increase, and it allows this increase in production and specifically cheaper, right? So it's much cheaper, so the goods can be sold much more cheaply. All right, just to give you one example of in a textile factory. So in 1813, 2,400 looms in 1813. In 1850, an enormous explosion, 224,000 with over 1 million workers working in these factories. And it's a lot different than work on the farm. Work on the farm, there was times of heavy activity, say around harvest time, but other times there wasn't much to do. So and you got up with the sun, you went down with the sun. There wasn't a schedule that you had to adhere to. All that is going to change in the factory system, so much so that we now organize our days sort of around this rigid schedule of the clock, and not so much the seasons or the sun. Just think of school. School is modeled on a factory system where you have a rigid schedule, and there's a certain period of time you're at school, and you have the bells that organize your movement. That is on purpose. That was created to help children learn how to adhere to this factory system model. And it really takes the creativity and the independence away from workers, because in a factory you are just doing mind-numbing work, right? You're not making the entire product. Eventually you're only going to be making one piece of the product, and these are dangerous conditions, and it's really hard work. And you see some examples here. These are women working in the textile factory, young children there working in the textile factory. And so let's now shift more toward effects. So it's going to create this industrial revolution is going to create two new social classes. The first are what's called the bourgeoisie, or this new rich, and then those workers, right? So the new rich, right? These bourgeois owners, the factory owners. So they're not the wealthy landowners, right? That have existed for centuries, right? They are a new kind of class, right? And they are going to become increasingly wealthy from their positions. You see just an example, right? Living this very relaxed, refined life upstairs, while the laborers are laboring and in horrible conditions in their factories or in their mines. And the other class that is created is the industrial worker. So these are not serfs, these are not peasants, they're not farmers, right? They are working in these factories, in these dangerous and dirty and polluted conditions, and they're going to see their death rates increase, their lifespans decrease as a result of these industrial cities like Manchester and Liverpool that are increasing and growing. Here's worker housing in Manchester, just to give one example of what it was like for workers, often crowded into one rooms, not living on their farms and in the villages as their ancestors had, but living in these homes, often controlled by the factory owners who owned them, and then they paid rent to them. And they are going to be portrayed in literature. If you've ever read Oliver Twist or other works of Dickens, and this new way of living, right? This industrial age is going to spawn protests as well as some reforms. So briefly, let's just review a few. So at first, there were some who really opposed the use of these machines and their threat to their way of life. Probably the most well-known are called the Luddites, named after this mythical figure supposed to live in Sherwood Forest, Ned Ludd, and they carry out a series of attacks. They're not really effective in changing much, but they live on in popular imagination. And in fact, it's a word now in the English language. If you call someone a Luddite, they are someone opposed to new technology or new innovations. And there's also going to be increasing conflicts between workers and between the factory owners. And here's just one example. In 1819, as British soldiers fire on British workers. But this change also inspires others to analyze new problems. And one problem, according to Thomas Malthus, was that this dramatic population growth that he saw happening in the 18th and the 19th century is going to outpace the food supply. And this population growth is occurring because as a result of industrial revolution, diseases and famines are becoming less and less common, and so people are living longer, and they're having more children. And he argued that, in fact, the poor should have less children, and then food supply would be able to keep up with the population. It turns out that that is not actually what has happened. The food supply, as you see represented by the straight curve, has not outpaced population, or not kept up with the population growth. In fact, innovations have allowed our species to increase our food supply to keep up with population. But you still see these issues crop up, and it's still potentially a problem that if our population outpaces the food supply, what will we do? I tend to think we'll continue to innovate and create solutions to those problems. All right. Also, new thinkings on economics, right? We have a shift away from this mercantilist idea of the state interfering in supply and demand, and a move to more market driven understanding of supply and demand, right? That begins with Adam Smith's famous book, The Wealth of Nations. David Ricardo builds on it and argues about this iron law of wages, that when wages are high, workers have more children, and that creates a large labor surplus that depresses wages. And so it's all about keeping wages low. All right. Also, so groups known as utilitarians, Bentham and Mill, argue the goal of society is the greatest good for the greatest number. So there is a role to play. So kind of push back against this free market, free enterprise idea of Ricardo and Adam Smith. And then, of course, the big reaction, and we'll talk more about this later, are the socialists who argue that this unfair distribution of wages and capital could only be stopped if groups, not individuals, own and operate the means of production, like the factories and the railroads, and what they mean by people as a society, usually in the form of a government. All right, these ideas of industrialization, right, increasing production, using machines and these new sources of power, it's going to spread from England, and by 1850 be concentrated in some key zones of on the European continent: Northeast France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Western German states, Northern Italy, and Saxony. I think I have a map on the next slide. Yep, here we go. right? See this sort of arc, right, across northern and Western Europe of these industrial areas. But look at all these other areas that are not industrialized, and these are still peasants. These are still small villages, and just look at this growth of railroads in 1850, represented by green, and just 30 years later, um, and a dramatic increase. All right, so those are causes and effects of in the Industrial Revolution. And so what I want you to do now is, on this chart, which I've put in Google Classroom, create a picture of causes and effects of the Industrial Revolution. So like those first two boxes, right, make them about the causes, and then the last two boxes make them about the effects. And it's called Get the Picture because I want you to include a picture of the cause, right? So think of it like you're working on your thesis statement, right? And you want to come up with your main points of what were the causes of the Industrial Revolution and what were the effects, right? You want to put that in a short phrase, but then illustrate it, right? So something a little different, something maybe a little bit more fun. So the picture that goes in the larger box on the top, and then the caption in the smaller box below, right? The title is Causes and Effects of the Industrial Revolution, right? 2 and 2. Let me know if you have any questions. I'll see you in our Google meeting.